Hey friends, you might have noticed that the search results for the C7 documentation site have degraded pretty significantly over the last couple of years. So in this video, I wanted to give you some more details on how it happens and what we're doing to fix it on the DX team. And so the first thing I need to talk about to explain this is SEO, and in particular duplicate content. The internet is full of duplicate content. Sometimes it's malicious duplication, like someone scrapes your site and then posts it uncredited. But sometimes it's perfectly altruistic syndication to reach broader audiences on a variety of sites or something. You don't see pure duplication in Google search results, and that is because when Google search engine, when their bots see duplicate content, they go ahead and they choose one as canonical. That now the search results don't show the duplicate content. They show what Google considers to be the original source. Now, to decide which version of the content is canonical, Google pieces together a story about how your page fits on the internet, and it uses a lot of different signals, one of which is which page is linked to more than the others. All of this is so that it can identify which one of these two pages, duplicate pages, is seen as the source. And the more it looks like the rest of the internet trusts your site, the more likely it is that Google's bot is going to give you that canonical robot arm. Duplication can even exist on your own site, and we have this on our documentation sites. Regardless of where the duplication is, we can set this hint on a page if we know that it's duplicate. That says link rel canonical. What this does is it suggests to Googlebot which one that we think is canonical to try to help build the evidence for one page over the other. The examples that Google gives in their documentation for non-malicious duplication are things like product pages, where the product is listed in multiple different category pages, but they never really talk much about documentation sites. And I think that a doc site has kind of an interesting spin on duplication. It's a little bit different. The C7 docs, for example, might have one page that talks about BPMN, and it has existed for many versions. Here it's like 7.18, it's even beyond this, past 7.14. The content changes very slightly over time, and in fact, sometimes it doesn't change at all across versions. Sometimes it's duplicated between, for say, version 7.14 and 7.15. Obviously, that seems like it could be enough to trigger Googlebot's duplicate content alarm and confuse it. Especially when you consider how other pages around the internet might be pointing to all these different versions. You can definitely see how I would have a hard time choosing the true canonical. But eventually it does pick one as canonical, and we hope that it picks the latest version of our documentation, so that when you do a search for BPMN on our site, you get version 7.18. But more likely, in our case, is that the canonical robot arm is pointed at an older version, not the most recent. In this case, a search of Google you would think would result in the older version, 7.16 showing up. Unfortunately, that is not the case for us. There's a lot of content that in 2021 just started to disappear from Google, from our C7 search results. And it started happening when we introduced this new hint to Googlebot, meta content equals noindex. We use this to tell Google not to index old versions of the C7 docs. It's applied to all of the older versions except for the current one. The tag basically marks a page as not to be included in Google's search index. It doesn't mean that Google can't see or crawl the page, but it does mean that the page will never show up in Google search results. And that's the boat that we are in. We applied this no index tag to every version except the current one. And we did this with the intention of telling Google not to choose these older versions as the canonical. It works fine when Google has its canonical robot arm pointed at a 7.18 page. Everything's great. But for a lot of pages, Google points at an older version, because specifying no index on a page does not actually mean this thing can't be canonical. It just means this thing shouldn't be indexed. So Google points its canonical arm at this old version that it doesn't have indexed in its search index. And this has the effect of basically de-indexing this from search results entirely. So now people can't find help on that subject through Google. And to amplify this problem, search on our C7 documentation website is driven by Google's search. So not only can people not find help topics on Google, they can't find it in our documentation. And this has had the effect of, as I understand it, our support team basically having to memorize the entire structure of the docs so that they can point users to the right place when they need help. We have taken several steps to try to fix this, and I'll do a very quick recap. The goal, if I can boil this down to one thing, it's really just we need to convince Google that 7.18 is canonical. If we do that, then all of those pages will end up in the search results. So this is basically all of a bunch of different things that we tried with those gaps in between each of these sections. It's kind of like you can group those things together. We tried a variety of adding versionless canonical links to the most recent versions. Versionless in the sense that we didn't include the URL or the version number in the URL, but the URL that didn't have a version redirected to the URL that had the version. We also added versioned canonical links to the most recent versions, a variety of those things. And then in combination with these other ways that we asked Google to crawl our site, we asked it to crawl a bunch of URLs that didn't have a version and redirected to the current version. We asked it to crawl a bunch of URLs that were actually the current version. And then we also asked Google to crawl some specific URLs of the current version. And then there's a whole lot of waiting in all of these combinations because Google's crawling and indexing processes take time. The results from all of this were not great. We had a lot of back and forth with the Google Search Console trying to get Google to accept the correct canonical, but we couldn't consistently make it happen. A lot of times pages would be unaffected by the changes that we made. Occasionally, some pages would get fixed, and we're seeing that there's slowly some pages, on average, I think search results are getting better. And then there are some cases where there were pages affected by our changes, but it was either lateral or they just like broke in a different way. Google, the frustration so far has been that Google just doesn't really seem that interested in what our opinion is on which URLs are canonical. And that's actually in their documentation very clearly laid out. They say that canonicals are only a hint, and they can, and they often do, just ignore it. So I wish that I could say that we had some breakthrough here, that there was some huge improvement that just fixed all of our search results, but that isn't the case. On the bright side, I do think that things are improving over time. So this is a screenshot from the Search Console that looks at duplicate without user-selected canonical pages. These have been declining over time, and these pages are basically like Google recognizes that it's a duplicate, and we didn't specify a canonical page on it. This is likely all of the pages from older versions where I haven't gone and applied this change to add a canonical link to the page. So this is a view of all these canonical tags that we've added slowly taking over. Crawled, currently not indexed pages are trending down, which is good. To give a little bit more clear definition of what this means, crawling and indexing are two separate steps for Google. So basically, like, these pages are in the process. They've been crawled, they haven't yet been indexed. There's not really anything we can do about these, but the downward trend suggests that hopefully there's less unfindable content over time. Most of our 7.18, that's currently the current version, most of those pages are stuck in this position, alternate page with proper canonical tag, which means that Basically, I think that these are from when we had versionless canonicals, when I had submitted all those redirecting versionless canonicals, which didn't have a version in the URL, and they redirected to 7.18. But I think that they just haven't been processed yet by Google. And so there where you see these trending down, this is a good thing, right? These alternate page with proper canonical tags. I think Google is slowly working its way through all of those pages that I've pulled, that I've put a proper versioned canonical URL on. Oops, I jumped a little too far ahead. The bad news about this trend that I was just talking about is that right as that downward trend starts here in this chart on December 3rd, this other trend starts. This is duplicate Google chose different canonical than user. This is where Google just thinks they know better than us. They don't care what we say about which one is the canonical. They think that they know the best because of the comprehensive story that they've been figuring out and that they can find on the internet. The numbers don't totally align between those two trends. Like when this one starts and the other one, when they both start at the same time, this one does go up while the other one goes down. It's not one-to-one. Not every page that's being processed in here is turning into one of these. Looking more to the future, what are we going to do with this moving forward? Because none of us are happy about it. One thing that we have noticed is that in the crawl report from Google Search Console, there is a large spike in October around the time that version 7.18 was released. So our hunch is that Googlebot will do a lot of crawling when there's new content on the site. And so our theory is if we have canonicals set up correctly, then and we build this comprehensive story properly for Googlebot so that everything's pointed to the right place, which would be the current version, then we just wait for this spike that will happen when we get to the 7.19 release in April, and hope that when Google's excited about crawling all of this new content, it corrects itself and points at a lot of the newer versions for things. One thing that I will point out that we haven't talked about that you might be thinking about is rebuilding or replacing the search functionality on the C7 docs to use something other than Google. And I just want to say our team doesn't have any intentions of investing that much effort into this at this point. So I think we are headed in the right direction for telling this comprehensive, compelling story for Google to pick the latest versions. We have the sitemap pointing to 7.18 as the canonical. Currently, all the versions back to 7.14 point to 7.18 as the canonical. When we release the 7.19 docs, most of these versions that are there will end up pointing at 7.19 instead of 7.18 with zero effort. There is one more experiment that is in progress right now that I think might also help tell that story, and that is to get rid of the no index tags that we have on pages. I think we added them to prevent Google from selecting old versions as canonical, but it definitely didn't do that. It didn't have that effect. And it seems like it has had a more negative effect than positive because those pages are now just completely unsearchable. It's been very hard to escape from, in addition, because Google doesn't want to do anything with no indexed pages when we submit them for crawling and indexing. So theoretically, I think if we have canonical hints on all of those old pages and they are indexed, that should help build the comprehensive story of, hey, Google, you really should pick 7.18. I'll be checking for the results of this experiment pretty soon. And if everything goes well, I'm going to think about applying this change everywhere before we get to April and version 7.19. And then one more important goal is that we don't want to make the same thing happen in C8. And unfortunately, I think there are some things that we need to fix here too. Our C8 documentation is built on a different tool. It's called Docusaurus, and one of the out of the box an interesting thing about the out-of-the-box implementation of Docusaurus is that it treats every page as self-canonical, which means that every one of these versions points to itself as the canonical. So the 8.1 page says 8.1 is the canonical version. 1.1 says 1.1 is the canonical. And this doesn't really have any effect. According to Google SEO advocates, self-referential canonicals do nothing unless the URL being visited doesn't match the canonical. And what they're talking about there is like query string parameters and stuff like that. But if every version of a page is saying that it's declaring itself as canonical, we're basically not giving any hints at all. So we need to correct that. And then the other thing we need to correct is that the sitemap for Docusaurus includes all versions. And I think that we don't want this because the sitemap is another one of those hints to Google about where the canonical pages are. So we want to reduce this down to just the current version, and right now 8.1. There are two advantages that C8 docs have over C7 that'll keep us from recreating this exact situation. One, we're not doing anything with no indexing. So even if Google chooses the wrong canonical in C8, we're still going to get Google search results. They just might be the wrong version. And then two, the insight search functionality isn't based on Google, it's based on Algolia. So even if we end in a similar boat where we get poor Google results, not that we want that or that we think that will happen, at least the insight search will still give proper results. Thanks for hanging out with me. Take care.
Hey, it's Steve from 6 months later. I want to give an update on this work. When I originally recorded this video, we were still not totally sure if our changes would have the impact that we were looking for, but now 6 months have gone by. We've released another version of our documentation, and I have an update that honestly surprised me a little bit. I mentioned earlier in the video that we had one last experiment that we were running with our 7.18 documentation. It involved the noindex tags that we had applied to all of the older documents. That experiment failed, and in the end, we chose to leave the noindex tags on all of the versions except for the most recent. So that's what this image demonstrates for version 7.18. All of the older versions are marked no index. They point at the current version with a canonical tag, and then only the current version is listed in the sitemap. Shortly after we made that decision, we also shipped our 7.19 version of the documentation, and then 7.19 became the only version that didn't specify no index. It was also the only version in the sitemap, and all other versions, including 7.18 now, because that was an older version, pointed their canonical at that new 7.19 version. We did this because we thought that this would build the most cohesive story for Google so that it would choose the correct canonical version for our documentation. And it worked. Google began indexing the correct version of the documentation, and users saw this as better search results. If you remember, that was the whole reason we were doing this. People were having trouble getting search results both in Google and inside of our insight search, which was driven off of Google. I mentioned that I was surprised by the results, and I won't say that I was completely surprised by the fact that it worked. I may have been a little surprised that it worked. What I was more surprised about was how effective the change really was. This is a view from the Google Search Console of the pages that Google has crawled and indexed from our most recent sitemap, that 7.19 version. There are 493 URLs listed in that sitemap. I can't account for 4 of them because Google only has 489 on this report. But of all of the URLs that Google has looked at, every single one is indexed. This is amazing. Throughout the work that we did here, I never once saw Google index one single set of content so completely. And honestly, I'm a little suspicious. It feels a little too good. But for now, I guess this view demonstrates that this work was a resounding success. So this is, I guess, this is maybe your takeaway. If you own a documentation site, this is a checklist that I have for you. If you don't want to end up in the same situation we did, where you were accidentally de-indexing yourself from Google, here's your list. It's short. It's 2 items. Number 1, your sitemap should contain only the current version, not all of the versions, because that's an indication to Google which one you think is canonical. And then second, all of your older versions should point to canonical at the current version, again, to suggest to Google that you think the newest one is the canonical version. Now, I don't mention anything about no index here. This is maybe straying into like opinion that isn't really backed by science. But you know, I mentioned all over this video that we had no index tags on our documentation. I actually don't think that no index would have any long-term positive effect that these two things wouldn't also have. That's my update. Thank you for hanging out with me.